Hello, and welcome to the Funders Together update on the federal budget webinar. I'm Andy Andiri, CEO at Funders Together, and we're so glad you took the time to join us today, as we know many in philanthropy have questions and concerns with the budget and working with Congress and the administration. This webinar is going to focus on what we know about the budget, eye on, and how philanthropy can be engaged moving forward. Housekeeping rules. All participants are on mute and will remain on mute throughout the presentation. Question during the presentation into the question box on your webinar panel, which is on the right-hand side of your computer screen. The question box looks like this. Question at any time, but we will save content-related questions for the end of our panel's presentations. Finally, this presentation is recorded. Because we want this to be a space for candid discussion amongst funders, this presentation will only be made available to Funders Together on the past events page of our website. Log in to view the recording. If you have any trouble doing so, you can email Lauren at funderstogether.org. Now I'd like to introduce today. Steve is the Vice President for Programs and Policy at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Regina is the Health Policy Organizer at the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council. And Doug is the Senior Policy Analyst for the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in Washington, D.C. Steve, would you mind starting us off?
Thanks, Amanda. And thanks for everybody for joining the call today. We're at a sort of a critical time in the determinations about how much money is going to be spent on various federal programs. So it's good to have a chance to update everybody here after our discussion earlier in the year. So as people probably know, I'm going to talk mostly about HUD programs and the HUD homeless programs, but some of what I have to say will carry over to other programs, and Regina and Doug will talk about others as well. As people know, the House and the Senate committees have now each passed a bill with HUD funding levels in them. Both in the House and the Senate, the bills they passed were based on overall budget amounts, overall amounts for non-defense spending that most people consider to be substantially too low. The people have heard the word sequestration applied to this based on formal congressional process, but it's basically based on determinations that were made several years ago about how much money should be spent on non-defense discretionary programs. And for the most part, since that time, Congress has enacted separate budget deals that raise those spending caps. But for this year, so far for the 2018 budget, they haven't passed an increase in the spending caps. So we're stuck with the spending caps they've got for now, and that makes the amounts too low. So I said the House and the Senate committees have each passed a bill. Now we're feeling like neither of these really keep up with the need for homeless services through HUD's McKinney-Vento programs. We feel like we're in a position with these programs that people around the country are more and more demonstrating that they can get great results for people who are homeless by using these programs to really focus on getting people off the streets, out of shelters, and into housing quickly. That kind of outcome-based orientation is something that these programs really try to adhere to. It's something that's written into the law by Congress. And it's something that the communities have really been putting to work. At the same time, there is great difficulty with the overall housing situation. So it's becoming more and more the case that people are losing their housing and becoming homeless at a faster pace. I think the data from the reports that HUD has made to Congress show this to be the case. people are becoming homeless at a faster pace. So even though communities are using their HUD homeless programs to get people out of homelessness faster and faster, they're turning around and seeing more and more people coming into their programs because they can't afford rent because of increased rents. The increase in employment hasn't really kept up with the increased rent. So many more people, particularly at the low end of the economic scale, are facing very severe housing problems that are turning into homelessness in many cases. The homeless programs have support from the administration to the extent that anyone in the administration has been talking about it. HUD Secretary Carson has, on a number of occasions, sort of called out the homeless programs as programs at HUD that are doing good work, that are working effectively and getting good results. The Commission on Evidence-Based Policy, that was an initiative that Paul Ryan undertook as the Speaker of the House, again called out work by homeless programs and the work of the funding of permanent supportive housing through the homeless programs as a good example of evidence-based policy that's had good results. So on a bipartisan basis, we're getting good support for these programs, but the question is really whether Congress will translate that into more money. As I said, the House and the Senate committees have both passed bills that are based on the sequestration level funding amounts and funding caps that are too tight. For the HUD homeless programs, the House bill is flat funding, the same amount of funding as in fiscal 2017. The Senate committee provided a modest increase, a $73 million increase, split between an initiative that repeats an initiative that was in the previous year's bill to provide communities with special targeting funded to youth homelessness, and trying to overhaul and create effective systems at the local community for rapidly reducing the number of youth who are homeless. And then there was also a new initiative in the Senate bill to provide rapid rehousing for people who are fleeing domestic violence, and really to try to make sure that the rapid rehousing model is set up in a way that it can meet the particular concerns that people fleeing domestic violence have. In both these, even with the increases, however, the Senate increase is still, we feel, not enough to keep up with the increased number of people who are becoming homeless that I talked about before. So I think in both these cases, well, we appreciate the work of the appropriators. We appreciate that they regarded the homeless programs as a priority, because many other programs were cut in these bills because of the low spending caps. Nevertheless, we feel because of both the increased effectiveness that people working in the field have gotten with these programs, and also the increased need based on increased numbers of people becoming homeless, that this is not a year where maintaining the status quo is really going to be sufficient, or where even modest increases like in the Senate bill are going to be sufficient. We're really going to need to really deal with the problems that exist. We're going to need a substantial increase in funding. The Alliance for the HUD McKinney programs has called for a $217 million increase to be what's necessary to keep up with the increased inflow into the system, as well as keep up with rising rents to the extent the homeless programs are paying for rental housing for people, which is a great deal of what the money goes for. And we will see what happens there. There's a lot of talk about making a new budget deal at some point later in the process. We are definitely for that because we feel like the existing spending caps are insufficient. There's a lot that will need to be done before then. The latest news on this, people may have heard just today, the House has been considering a package of several different appropriations bills, again, based on the low spending caps set by sequestration, or even less than the sequestration amount. The overall, what they call a minibus, it's a sort of a smaller version of an omnibus appropriations bill, but the minibus package, which included the HUD bill, included the HHS and labor bills, passed by about 13 votes, with 25 members not voting, including the chair of the subcommittee that looks at the T-HUD bill. So I think it's still very much the case that there's not any kind of rousing support for trying to do appropriations at that low level. So we feel like there will continue to be opportunities later in the year to get more money on the table and really fund these programs to the level they're needed. So let me stop there and turn it back to Amanda.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve, for that update. Let's then turn to Doug.
And thanks for having me on today. Good to talk to you. Just to add a few points to what Steve has already said about the budget situation. I mean, first, just where are we with respect to some of the other rental assistance programs that are important for reducing homelessness? I think it's fair to say that in both the House and Senate bills that were approved by the relative committees, there was a commitment to directing resources such as they had available to at least ensuring that rental assistance is continued to current number of families. At least that was the goal, explicitly stated goal by both committees, and they did prioritize funding for extending rental assistance. However, because of the very tight spending caps that are in place, neither committee, as Steve has already indicated, was really successful in meeting that goal. And so, for instance, there were significant reductions in public housing funding in the House bill, but most significantly, from our standpoint, neither the House nor the Senate bill provides nearly sufficient funding even to renew all the housing choice vouchers that families are currently using, to renew those next year. As you know, the voucher program is the largest federal rental assistance program, and there are many communities around the country, in LA, elsewhere, where local housing authorities are setting aside a certain number of vouchers towards a community-based effort to end chronic homelessness or reduce homelessness in other ways. And they largely depend on the existence of what we call turnover vouchers. So these are vouchers that are made available when families leave the program, to make those available to people who are homeless so they can exit shelter or move off the street into permanent housing. And when renewal funding is insufficient, those turnover vouchers basically dry up as agencies stop reissuing vouchers when families leave the program. And unfortunately, this year, the 2017 round of appropriations, while Congress did provide a funding increase to renew vouchers, it was not enough to fully cover the cost of rent inflation and so on. And so agencies are facing a shortfall this year. They received just 97% of the renewal funding for vouchers that they needed. And because of that, especially earlier in the year, a significant number of agencies stopped reissuing vouchers. So it's very important that in the 2018 round of funding that Congress does provide enough money to cover the cost of renewals, so agencies can begin reissuing vouchers again, and so on. So more specifically, there's a very large shortfall on the House bill. The Senate bill provided more funding for a lot of programs. I mean, overall, the Senate Transportation HUD Subcommittee received a much larger allocation in the Senate than it did in the House, and overall there's about $1.9 billion in additional resources for HUD programs in the Senate bill relative to the House, and most of those additional resources flow to the three big rental assistance programs: vouchers, project-based Section 8, and public housing, though, as Steve mentioned, there's also an increase for McKinney Homeless Assistance Grants. But even with the increase in the Senate bill, we believe that it's at least several $100 million short of what's needed to renew all vouchers in use. So that's something we're concerned about very much as the process moves forward and Congress hopefully moves towards completing 2018 funding legislation by December. As Steve said, there's been ongoing talk all year from both Republicans and Democrats about the need to raise the Budget Control Act spending caps that have placed such strong constraints on domestic spending as well as defense spending. We're expecting to see serious negotiations about the caps, and probably in October. We'll see where those go. But I think it's fair to say that absent any change in the caps, what we're left with is a negotiation between the House and Senate at the current cap levels on spending for HUD programs. And at the end of the day, you're likely to see program funding levels that roughly fall somewhere between what the House and Senate bills include, which would not be a satisfactory outcome. So raising the caps is essential, really, to free up some additional resources for domestic programs that can be directed to ensure that at least we're continuing to assist the same number of families using vouchers and other forms of HUD assistance, and potentially to make additional resources available for some investments to reduce homelessness by expanding assistance as well. So that's important to keep in mind. I'm sure Regina is going to talk a bit about where we are on the ACA. What else do I want to mention? A couple of other things that are on our here at the center. I mean, tax reform is also on the agenda this fall very much. I don't want to go into it in great detail, but we are very concerned about the risk posed by tax reform that would lose significant amounts of revenue, which while there has been talk this year about goals of a revenue neutral form of tax reform where any reductions were offset by increases in receipts elsewhere, or at least deficit neutral tax reform. But our fear is that at the end of the day, we end up with a tax bill that loses significant amounts of revenue, which reduces resources available to the federal government to invest in housing assistance for homeless people and others with urgent needs. In addition, there's also the risk of course, of attaching, that Congress will attempt to attach cuts in other safety net programs like Medicaid or SNAP to offset some of the costs of these tax reductions. So that's certainly something to keep an eye on too. I want to mention just one other thing. I know some of you are very interested in community efforts to expand access to opportunity for low-income families. The Housing Voucher Program has a lot of potential in this respect because vouchers are portable and they enable families to move to locations where there are better schools, safer neighborhoods, access to jobs, and so on. HUD recently suspended a policy initiative put in place by the Obama administration that was a significant step forward in expanding voucher holders' access to opportunity, and I just want to flag it. The policy is called Small Area FMRs, Fair Market Rents. What the policy does basically is requires agencies to set voucher subsidies at a level that is consistent with rents at the neighborhood or specifically zip code level rather than metro area fair market rents. The problem with metro area fair market rents is that when families use a voucher, typically the subsidy will be too low for them to really locate, at least affordably, in a neighborhood with access to good schools and other kinds of opportunities, because rents tend to be higher in those neighborhoods. At the same time, the subsidy tends to be too high. There's really an issue of overpayment in neighborhoods with much lower rents that tend to be poor. And so the policy required agencies in 23 metro areas to use small area fair market rents in order to reduce the concentration of voucher holders in poor neighborhoods. This policy has been tested in a number of areas around the country and has worked well there, but HUD recently suspended that mandatory policy in these 23 neighborhoods. So that's something we're working on too 23 metro areas. That's something we're working on too to try to reverse. I will just add that while HUD lifted or suspended the mandatory use of small area FMRs in these 23 metro areas, agencies around the country may continue to use them on a voluntary basis. And I think it's in communities where there's strong interest among housing authorities or other stakeholders in expanding opportunities for families, it's certainly worth continuing to encourage agencies to use the tool of small area FMRs as well as other tools to make it easier for families to move, relocate into better neighborhoods. And I think that's where I'll end. I'll be happy to answer questions later.
Thank you so much. Regina, can you give us an update on the ACA?
I absolutely can. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Because I am the health person here, I will comment on the labor HHS package. To be frank, with all that's going on elsewhere, I know here at Healthcare for the Homeless, we are so jumbled up and busy with other legislative issues. We haven't kept as close of an eye on HHS funding, but overall, we haven't seen many red flags there. The House and Senate both put out their budget packages. I know Steve touched on that. And overall, HHS is faring about $4.5 million increase overall, with very few programs getting noticeable cuts. There were some small increases to telehealth and rural health programs, which we know impacts the population we're concerned about. SAMHSA is another big program, and of course, I printed out a bunch of pages to have in front of me, and I forgot to print out the HHS numbers. But overall, we know that under SAMHSA, we are seeing the 21st Century Cures opioid $1 billion over 2 years is there. And we have again, with everything else going on, the HHS funding, and especially SAMHSA, is not our major red flag now. So we're feeling okay there. And maybe later, I know Steve and Doug dig deep into appropriations more. They can fill in the gaps where I lacked here. But moving on from there, I believe when I last spoke with this group, we were in the midst of ACA repeal and replace chaos. And as much as I would love to tell you we are on the other side of that, unfortunately we are not. The the legislative tool that Congress was using to repeal and replace back in July, which allowed them to pass something with only 50 votes rather than 60, that tool, that budget resolution reconciliation tool, is still there and exists until September 30th. So we saw this cataclysmic failure and drama with John McCain earlier in July. We thought we were in the clear, but as of this week, we have seen Senator Graham and Senator Cassidy drop their own plan. And I won't go into the weeds on this. This is, of course, happening all adjacent to the budget negotiations, but much like what we were worried about in July, this would be a major Medicaid overhaul. I believe the number I saw was $375 billion over the next 10 years from Medicaid expansion in the marketplace. So we all know when states get less money for Medicaid, very, very low income and people get the brunt of that. So this is really concerning. We are hoping that with everything, with all the budget negotiations, they won't be able to do this by the 30th. But of course, as we all know, we're not writing anything off. This is all something we're following. It's something to worry about, something to advocate about. So from there, another healthcare fund was CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program, which provides coverage to children. And this, we got an agreement to continue to fund this for 5 years. That also expired on September 30th. That was all, handshakes and smiles with strong bipartisan support, but they haven't exactly outlined how they're going to get funds from this. And as Doug mentioned, we're following along. We expect possible entitlement cuts, possible cuts to Medicaid to pay for that, and that is something we do not want to happen. So we're following that there. And per usual, something to watch out for when we're hearing about all of this is that, especially when it comes to the dollars and cents, all of these proposed cuts are being done under cost efficiency and state flexibility. And it's important to keep in mind that, of course, that sounds great, but to us, especially in the homeless healthcare provider community, that just means less Medicaid money to the states. That means less resources to provide care. So what else in Congress? Health center funding. This is a big one, and there's a lot of great, if you're interested in hearing a lot more of this, I recommend checking out resources from NAC, the National Association of Community Health Centers. They're really taking the lead on this. But at the end of the fiscal year, we were waiting for about $1.5 billion for health centers in the discretionary funding, and we did get that in the budget package. But what is most concerning is the mandatory funding. Health centers are funded through both discretionary and mandatory, and 70% of that mandatory health center funding is outside of the regular appropriation process. That's $3.6 billion. So that's a major concern, and it also runs out on September 30th. So rather than appropriating that to the budget process, we're still waiting on a bill to pass to outline a continuation of that mandatory funding. And historically, health centers have strong bipartisan support. We've seen Tom Price, Secretary of HHS, just put out a publication on their website in support of health centers. There's a lot of feel-good talks and noises. We haven't heard anything against them, but we're coming down to the September 30th deadline, and we need that $3.6 billion of mandatory funding. So this is something we're advocating on. And again, I recommend if you're more interested in that, you could really, I can send Amanda some resources, but if you look at the National Association of Community Health Centers, they have a lot of great advocacy alerts and are really, really leading the charge there. I know this is a federal budget webinar, but I will go off on a little bit to what else. The other thing we're following is we know that even if Congress isn't able to do their repeal and replace, the states are still able to adjust and amend their Medicaid program through State 1115 waivers. And we know that waivers can adjust state Medicaid programs. They aren't inherently good or inherently bad, but with the new administration, we saw a change in culture and an invite for states to start putting things in their waivers such as cost sharing, lockout periods, work requirements, drug testing. Really, if you think of what would keep someone experiencing homelessness unable to access their health insurance, it's all those things. So it's very concerning. We've seen a couple states, I want to say 9, have submitted waivers. And right now we're waiting a bit on pins and needles to see what the administration will approve, which will of course set a precedent. So that is something we're following at the states. And then to wrap it all up on a human rights, somewhat of a positive note, at Healthcare for the Homeless, here where I work, we are of course, like many of you, coming from the human rights perspective, and for any piece of legislation that increases access to care. And so that includes Bernie Sanders' single payer bill that came out this week. From the policy side, we're not sure if we see that as a reality, but from a political side, this will be important. So we're following that because of all the political repercussions of such a bill. And I will say from the funding perspective, bills like this are a big deal because we know right now our clinics and low-income healthcare providers really count on funders to fill in the gaps of care, to fund the eyeglasses, to fund the dentures, and implementing some form of universal care would allow funders to spend money on other things to prevent and end homelessness and not dentures. So that's the view of this from the funder's perspective, and that's what I have on healthcare. I'm sure I missed a bunch of things, and happy to answer any questions, and hopefully Steve and Doug can chime in on the budget side where I can't. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Regina. So now we're going to open it up to questions, and you can type, again, questions in the question box. While we're opening it up to questions, we'll just also give you some time to think about some questions that you have. We just want to mention some upcoming opportunities to learn and engage with funders together. We'll have a webinar focusing more on health and innovative housing solutions on Thursday, September 21st. We'll have a conversation with myself and staff members from USICH on Thursday, September 28th, following their thought leader convening 2 weeks ago around ending family homelessness. We have an in-person site visit in Cleveland to look at their work around ending homelessness, particularly the Sisters of Charity Foundation and how they're leading as a part of our youth network, and that is September 25th through 27th. And we have our first convening of the Foundations for Employment and Housing. That is our new community of practice around looking at the connection between housing stability and employment. We'll convene October 18th and 19th in partnership with the Heartland Alliance. And we have a community of practice getting started around United Way's committed to ending homelessness. All of this can be found on our website, and if you have any questions, you can contact Jennifer Olney. Her email is at the bottom of the screen. So, Lauren, do we have any questions?
We do. So the first one is, can you tell us a little bit about the status of USICH? And this is open.
Let me, this is Steve Berg. Here's what I would say about that. The Senate committee bill includes full funding for USICH and includes permanent extension of USICH. This is not a surprise because the separate bill to do that was co-sponsored by Senator Jack Reed and Senator Susan Collins, who are the co-chairs of the committee that put together the Senate HUD funding bill. So they're 100% on board with that. The House bill, on the other hand, continues what has become now the usual, which is that the initial House bill lets USICH expire. As people know, the USICH, the Interagency Council on Homelessness, has a hard sunset under the law setting it up. So unlike other programs where there's sort of an authorized a date through which the program is authorized, but if you get to that date and nobody does anything, it just continues. In this case, the law is different, and it puts USICH out of business if that date doesn't continually get extended. This will be worked out when the House and Senate committees sit down to negotiate a final deal. And we'll continue to be watching out for that. I'm hopeful that they will be able to come to a conclusion that USICH is doing important work.
Great, thank you. Another question that popped up is, so we've talked about a lot of things from tax reform to the homelessness and housing programs and ACA. What do each of you see as some opportunities for philanthropy to be engaged in some of these things?
Hi, this is Regina. I can start. I think, as I said, I mentioned this before in reference to universal health care bills, but it really applies in all Medicaid and everything we're talking about now is that in healthcare, we know we really want philanthropy to be able to engage outside into more of the social determinants of health and spend your resources more efficiently there, rather than picking up the pieces in healthcare, just trying to fund where Medicaid isn't funding, where state dental coverage isn't funding. So that's an angle and a message from funders that for us in healthcare, we find really valuable. And also to kind of double back on what I said about waivers, although not all states have waivers, not all states are expanding, there's vast differences. Everything that's happening in the state waiver process and everything that CMS is putting out is setting a precedent for going forward. So I think it's important for everyone to just keep abreast of what's happening and follow that so you can start to prepare in case where you are does adopt those policies and does follow along. So that's from me. Thank you, guys.
And I would add, this is Steve again. I would add there's some pretty consistent sort of messaging we make about what's going on with homelessness that I think it's important for these decision makers to hear. That funders can be very helpful in helping communities tell their stories about what's going on with homelessness. The very severe ill effects that homelessness has on the people who are homeless, on many different systems that are trying to make the communities better, like healthcare systems, like schools, where homelessness interferes with their ability to do their jobs. And at the same time, telling the stories about how effective programs have made this situation better. I mean, I think these are the things that we need policymakers to hear, including policymakers who are making decisions about the federal budget, and getting this sort of word out, getting these stories told, I think is an important thing.
Great, thank you. Another question that's come in is, can any of you talk a little bit about what's happening at HUD right now and how you're working with the new leadership?
This is Regina, and I know that from the healthcare, Ben Carson says that he has the experience and is coming from a medical background, and I know in the healthcare community we're trying to latch on to that, and particularly with homelessness, invite him to visit our clinics and see what's happening on the ground. So advocacy-wise and engagement-wise, we're doing our best to play it from that angle. No comment on how successful we've been on that so far.
Well, this is Doug. So I mean, I'm hesitating here partly because HUD has so few senior staff in position to date. We found it a little bit hard to engage at this point. So, for instance, there's no Assistant Secretary for Public and Indian Housing at the moment, and there are missing staff running the voucher program and elsewhere. But hopefully that will all change soon. There's word that, for instance, Pam Pattenow, there will the vote on her confirmation today before the Senate to be, I think, Deputy Chief of Staff. For those of you who don't know her, she ran the community development programs at HUD for a while. She was a lead policy staff for the Housing Commission at the Bipartisan Policy Commission, and is very familiar with a wide range of housing problems, and is supportive of strong bipartisan solutions. So we're cautiously optimistic that it's positive for her to be headed over there. We're actually meeting this afternoon with the person who's the acting Assistant Secretary for PIH, and so we'll know a lot more later this afternoon, I think, about what's going on over there. More generally, what I find interesting, and Regina mentioned this, is that Secretary Carson has been talking a lot about looking at ways to improve outcomes for HUD-assisted households, expanding opportunities for them to improve their outcomes, help them work towards self-sufficiency, and so on. There's a lot of very positive language coming out of the Secretary in recent months, but there's really a huge gap in information about what that might mean in terms of specific policies. I do think it's important, though, to to kind of reinforce those basic messages that he's giving, and to push HUD to the extent that we can in directions that achieve some of those goals in ways that are constructive and positive.
Yeah, this is Steve. I would agree with that. As people may know, Nan Roman, who's my boss at the Alliance, and Amanda and others went to meet with Secretary Carson early on about work on homelessness. Since that time, he's made a couple of speeches where he spoke is very much sort of on message as far as we're concerned in terms of what these programs do and why they're important. And he's done that in various instances of speaking to the press. The political appointee who oversees the part of HUD that includes homeless assistance is a guy named Neil Ratcliffe, who worked in the city of Houston and was very much part of the important work that Houston has done to reduce the number of homeless people. He's been confirmed by the Senate already. He's on the job. So we feel that there is someone there and high up in the HUD hierarchy who really understands what this is all about. So we're hopeful. The issue still remains. It's up to Congress to decide how much money these programs are getting, and that's got to be a big part of the issue. But I think in terms of the movement that HUD has made in terms of trying to make the homeless programs more effective and efficient, I think that will continue.
Great, thank you very much. Just a reminder, if you do have a question, you can go ahead and enter it into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. We have a little bit more time, so feel free to ask the panelists your burning questions. Another question that we did have, so it seems like a lot of attendees on the phone are focused on some more local efforts. And so we had a question about how can local funders be involved when it comes to opportunities with the federal budget?
This is Regina. I'm going to steal Steve's answer from the last question and say that I think stories and showing Congress and administration how these dollars are really being used make a really big impact.
Yeah, this is Doug. I mean, I agree with that. I think when it comes to the budget issues, I mean, we've seen these incredibly austere budgets coming out of Congress the last several years. To its credit, though, I think Congress has done given the extreme, the inadequate resources that they've decided to make available overall, they've made reasonable choices about how to direct those resources in ways that at least mitigate the harm on the ground in terms of cuts in HUD housing assistance programs. To be more specific, while we're at risk of losing rental assistance this year and next, we haven't lost a significant amount to date over the last couple of years, and that's because of the way Congress has directed money. However, it's very clear that if we don't raise the caps and make a significant amount of additional resources available, efforts to reduce homelessness are pretty much going to grind to a halt at the local level. And as Steve has emphasized, it's really important to tell the positive stories about how effective programs are working and achieving their goals. But it's also important to tie those stories to the need for additional resources to make further progress in future years.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that. I mean, I always tell people who are working in programs at the local level that they need to treat their members of Congress as a funder and treat them with the idea that they need to make them partners in what they're doing. And I think local funders, it's the same thing. Every community has a member of Congress, and larger cities have several members of Congress, have 2 senators, and a big part of what those members of Congress do is try to figure out how federal money should be distributed in the place they represent. And in that way, they are very much partners to the funder community in those same cities, and I think should be dealt with and communicated with and collaborated with in that spirit. I think that would be very helpful.
Great, thank you. We do have another question come in. So do any of the panel members believe there's an opportunity to advocate for these programs based upon the economic impact that these programs trigger? Consumer stories just seem to cut it with Pennsylvania elected officials, but money does catch the attention and respect of many. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Oh, sure. I think Doug has done a lot of work on sort of the larger HUD programs and the effect they have. I mean, this is money coming into a community that's coming into low-income neighborhoods to help people pay rent, and that has definite positive effects.
Yeah, I mean, there's a fair amount of evidence that at least when economies are weak, that when you provide assistance to low-income households, they make use of that assistance by spending it locally, which has a way of invigorating local economies. And with respect to the housing assistance program specifically, this is also true for rental assistance, and it can have an added positive impact in areas where housing markets are weak as well. So, I tend to think of Rust Belt communities, for example, where the markets are relatively weak, which means that owners, many of which are kind of small mom and pop operations, they may own a single duplex or a couple of those or something like that. They really struggle to fill units and collect rents that are sufficient enough for them to maintain their properties in good condition and prevent neighborhood blight. And rental assistance programs can actually play a positive role in filling units and helping owners to maintain their properties in good condition, as well as freeing up additional resources within assisted households that they spend in local supermarkets and so on that help to boost the economy in that way. The problem is that this is an argument that I think makes a lot of sense in outline, but there's, as far as I know, no one's really done a hard study to demonstrate this in the context of rental assistance specifically. There's lots of evidence that's been collected in looking at unemployment insurance and food stamps and so on, and the positive economic impacts that those have, especially when the economy is weak. But as far as I know, no one has specifically looked at rental assistance. But I think the argument does make sense.
This is Regina. There are numerous cost and economic arguments to make for investing in healthcare. We always say that health center funding and Medicaid funding they're also jobs bills and they're also business bills, keeping people employed. You can easily show the growth of our health centers after Medicaid expansion. We have the numbers on this. And I think those arguments are great to make, and those data points really work in Congress in some ways. I will add that what is concerning about taking healthcare to that economic argument is that we see it twisted back on us in dangerous ways. We see the dangerous narrative of the able-bodied adult. We start seeing things like work requirements to get healthcare, and although there is a strong economic and cost argument for all that we want, we still need to make sure we're emphasizing that healthcare and housing comes first and needs to be invested in. We do that and then we work, not the other way around. So we are making those arguments, and we have the numbers to share with anyone who wants to do that. But I will add please be wary, because we see the negative of that too.
Great, thank you so much. So that's all the time we have for questions now. So I'll go ahead and turn it back to Amanda to close us out.
Thank you to our panelists for their thoughtful insights and for making the time today to give us an update on what's going on. I know they'll be available for individual questions if you have them. We'll also be sending this recording and any resources we have on our website around working with the new administration and Congress with a philanthropy lens. So I just want to thank you for your time and hope you all have a great day. Thank you.